Today is July 8, 2017, and we are going to continue our investigation of the community rule. Let us start with asking our Heavenly Family to guide us. Eloheinu, our mighty ones, first, thank you so much for bringing to light providentially the community rule and the other Dead Sea Scrolls. And thank you for drawing our minds to be at a point where we are willing and ready to consider what they have to say. Please help us to understand where we are wrong, to correct our misconceptions, and also to discover what is true and to understand why each element of truth is indeed true. Thank you so much. Help us to conduct a genuine experiment and to love each other more and more. Thank you. We ask this b'shem tzemach, in the name of Branch. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, so I'll start with a brief recap of what the community rule is. Essentially, the community rule is a literary composition from the 2nd century BCE, written in the Hebrew language by a Jew or several Jews living in the land of Palestine, and it represents a community in terms of their beliefs, their practices, their self-identity, and so on. The community rule was found in 1947 among the very first Dead Sea Scrolls to be discovered in modern times, and ever since it has been recognized to be a very important document, not only because it tells us so much about the community whom it represents, known sometimes as the Qumran community or as the Essenes, but also because it has such strong connections with writings which were later composed and compiled into the New Testament, and also other early Nazarene writings such as the Odes of Solomon, the Epistle of Barnabas, the Didache, and others. The community rule clearly had some sort of influence on Jesus and his followers, and as we talked about last night and on previous calls, that influence was positive. They considered the ideas, or at least some of the ideas, expressed in the community rule to be part of God's message for humanity. Certainly they considered the teacher of righteousness, who was the founding prophet of the Qumran community, to be a true prophet. And we've talked about the evidence for that on previous occasions. And even if the teacher of righteousness did not write the community rule, some of his ideas are certainly expressed therein. So those are some of the reasons why the community rule is important. Also, we understand that it is important just in its own right in terms of what it has to say on many different issues, in terms of how society should work, in terms of morality, in terms of the nature of truth, and several other things. So we've been studying this for, I think, over a year and a half now, and we, last weekend, came to the end of the 4th column of the best preserved copy of the community rule, known as 1QS. And that particular copy has 11 columns of text, and the end of the 4th is actually a natural break point within the flow of the text. And getting into column 5, there are some other issues that we have to deal with that we haven't really dealt with so far in dealing with the first 4 columns. So last night we talked about textual criticism in regard to the community rule and how we have to compare the various copies of the text and to study the differences between them in order to discern as best as we can the history of the wording of the text as well as the history of the composition of the text. And the reason why we want to do this is because it is all part of the methods that we have to employ in studying the community rule. First, we have to find out what it really says in its original setting, without imposing our own stuff onto it and judging it according to a misrepresentation of it. No, we want to judge it according to what it really says. And in order to discover that, we have to find out what it really says. And so the wording of the text is important, and textual criticism has that as one of its primary objectives. And in addition to that, we do have the question as to whether the community rule is a literary unit, as in all one writing by one author, or if it is a composite literary work, and if so, how so? Is it that there were separate authors who wrote separate parts of the community rule, but it was a collaborative effort and they combined those parts all intentionally and they all wanted it combined and so on? Or is it that one person wrote kind of an original edition of the community rule and then they themselves later wrote several other editions, or just another edition and added sections? Or is that what happened? Or did someone write a text and then someone later come along and add to that text, even perhaps after the death of the original author? Or could it be that these were originally separate texts by separate authors, none of which had intention or knowledge of the later combining of their various independent texts? These are all things for us to consider. And there may be more options, but we really do want to find out really the nature of the text of the community rule, because we want to judge it rightly. And if we come to it with the assumption that it is a unit in and of itself in terms of its literary composition and judge it according to that, we may incorrectly judge it. So we have to definitely discover the reality of this text. So last night we read 1QS column 5 and going in several lines into column 6. And then we read some cave 4, a particular cave 4 fragment that parallels that. And there were some differences. For instance, the Cave 1 manuscript, 1QS, which is the best preserved and most complete copy of the community rule, talks about entering the community and coming under the authority of the sons of Zadok and the multitude of the men of the community. In the Cave 4 manuscript that we read, it does not say to come under the authority of the sons of Zadok. It says simply to come under the authority of the community, of the congregation. Well, that's a difference. And in those Cave 4 manuscripts, the sons of Zadok are not mentioned at all. So, which did it originally say? Was it originally with the sons of Zadok or without the sons of Zadok? How did the change from one to the other occur? Did someone deliberately add something or take something away? Or if it originally had the aspect of the sons of Zadok, did someone, in copying the manuscript, accidentally skip over the sons of Zadok part? That's something we have to discover. Also, another difference, the Cave 1 manuscript, 1QS, has a couple places in column 5 that reference passages of Scripture, saying, "It is written," and then quoting something from, in one instance, Exodus, and in another instance, Isaiah. In the Cave 4 manuscripts, the "as it is written" and the quote of those scriptures is gone. And the text flows fine and everything, but there's no scripture reference. So what is the history of that change from one to the other, and in which direction does the change go? Were the references to Scripture added, or were they taken away? This is all part of the work of textual criticism for us to discover that, and this may very well have an impact on how we understand the community rule in its original phase, whatever that may be. And I'll say, it used to be that the role of textual criticism when it came to the Bible was to discover the original wording of a text. However, in recent years, scholars have raised the issue as to whether it really makes sense to talk about the original edition of a text, the original wording of a text. What do we mean by original? Was there an original copy by the author that was handwritten, and then a professional scribe or some other scribe to the public? Perhaps. So which one are we going for? Are we looking for the one that was originally written by the author, or the first copy of that original? Or were there several, like a cluster of first copies that were all copies from the original? They're going to be different to some degree because scribes are not perfect. They do not make absolutely perfect copies. And then you have other issues like, what if an author wrote a text and then decided to come out with a revised edition of that text? Which one is the original wording? Well, depending on what we mean, it could be one or the other. So that's kind of an issue to keep in mind, that there might be more than one wording which was considered appropriate according to the author. Also, we just have to remember that the way that texts were published in the ancient world was not the same as they are published today. The way that they were published back then was that someone would write something, and then a copy or copies would be handwritten, and those copies would be given out to others or sold to others, and people could then make copies or hire someone to copy it. It was a very slow, meticulous task of copying manuscripts, since everything had to be done letter by letter, all by hand. And so in the ancient world, it simply was not the case that, if you have a text that there's more than one copy of, there is no one wording or one spelling of every word, because none of them are letter for letter the same. So we have a far more fixed conception, or I should say we have a conception of literary works as being far more fixed today than they actually were in the ancient world. With the printing press, you basically get all of the words and letters how you want them, hopefully without mistake, and then it is printed en masse with that exact wording and that exact spelling. It should be the same, especially with digital printing. It's going to be the same. Even with older printing presses, with plates and ink, it was the same, other than if the ink happened to blotch out on a certain place or whatever. But it's the same at that point. The words and letters are actually the same. Prior to the printing press, that was not the case. So no one would expect that their copy of a text would match word for word, letter for letter, another copy of the exact same text. So in that sense, textual criticism wouldn't have really made a whole lot of sense to people in the ancient world, because it's like, well, how do you think of an original text or original wording when everything, my copy and another person's copy, it's all somewhat different? At the same time, of course, I think people would have understood that along with those differences, you would end up, to a certain degree, potentially getting further and further away from how the author actually wrote it. So that's kind of the purpose of textual criticism. It's to discover what the original wording was insofar as is possible, but it's broader than that, in that we want to understand the history of the text. And if textual criticism can inform us of the composition of a text, then that also is very useful. Just like I've mentioned before, an example from Samuel, and how the Masoretic text of Samuel has a somewhat confused story of David and Goliath. And on one hand, it seems like it's saying that David already knew Saul and he played music for him and all of that, all before the David and Goliath incident. And then when it comes to the David and Goliath story, all of a sudden Saul has to meet David for the first time, and he doesn't seem to know who he is. And it's somewhat confused and somewhat odd. Well, in other manuscripts of Samuel, as represented in the Septuagint, whole chunks of what is present in the Masoretic text is absent. And when you read the Septuagint story all straight through, it makes perfect sense. There's not this incongruity that we find in the Masoretic text. And what's more is when you take all the sections that are present in the Masoretic text but absent in the Septuagint and put them together, they seem to make sense as a narrative as well. This is manuscript evidence discovered by comparison critically, so, a text critical method, which actually informs us of the composition of the text. What it shows us is that the Masoretic text version of the story of David and Goliath and the lead up to it was really originally two separate literary works that were combined together. And when the form of the text present in the Masoretic text was found, or when those manuscripts were copied, those two stories were already combined, whereas the Septuagint version of it comes at a time prior to the combining of those texts, and only one of them is present in the Septuagint. So that's how textual criticism can lead to discoveries concerning the composition of the text, in addition to simply the original wording. You could find out if it's a composite and which parts were originally from something else. So this is what we have to do with the community rule, and there are some things that I'd like to read regarding the community rule overall before we, get back into reading what is column 5 in 1QS and its parallels in Cave 4 fragments. But before any of that, I just wanted to ask if anyone has comments and or questions.
Yeah, I just wanted to share with everybody. I've indulged myself all Sabbath in listening to a CD that Trent, you gave us to listen to and probably have left. Do you realize that I still have that CD called The Scroll of Scripture and Interpretation? Are you looking for it?
Oh,
anyway.
I did not realize that you still had that. The one put out by Biblical Archaeology Society, right?
Right.
Okay.
So I decided I was going to indulge in it because you've left it here for a few months, and so I put it on, and I remember trying to listen to it in the beginning, like when was that? I can't remember, 3, 4, 5 months ago. And, my brain just couldn't get into it, or it just, it was beyond what I was used to in knowledge and stuff, right? But anyway, I decided to turn it on today, and man, I can't stop listening to it because of all the background that you've gone through with us on the calls of the Dead Sea Scrolls, Qumran community, community rule. It's so much more interesting now. But anyway, so I just wanted to share, there was one lecture by a scholar named Henry W.M. Reitz, and his topic was on the covenant renewal ceremonies at Qumran. So that's what I left off with just before I got on the call. So I'm in my little community, or my Qumran bubble here. So, and he quoted, I'm going to quote what he said in his lecture. And it's just amazing because he says, the Qumranites understood themselves as the ones whom God is revealing to them an ongoing revelation, right? So scholars have unlocked this truth from all this past writing and past documents, 2,000-year-old manuscripts. And I found this so intriguing because here are scholars, world-renowned scholars at that, giving public lectures describing the Qumran community as there's another name I found them to give the Qumran community besides the Sons of Light. They give them that name, a community of renewal of a new covenant. Have you heard of that, Trent?
Yeah, it's like basically a covenant renewal community, although that's not used as like a specific name for the Qumran group. That's like a classification of a type of group. And so like some scholars would say that the Qumran community was a covenant renewal community, and also the early Jesus movement was a covenant renewal community, and it's just a term used to describe a community that believes that it is renewing the covenant with God. Right.
So, okay, so this is what the scholar was describing, right? So, so again, he describes the Qumranites as the ones whom God is revealing to them an ongoing revelation. And what's amazing is here we are, okay, living realistically, materially, these descriptions, and not a lot of people know it. So I'm just in this little world right now where I'm listening to all these lectures of world-renowned scholars talking about this, and here we are also learning this and even coming close to realistically living it in a true way. They talked about they were serious with their appointed times and keeping the Sabbath, etc. Right? So, I'm just in amazement at this whole thing with scholars versus reality.
Yeah, really fascinating. That reminds me, I forget, I have it somewhere. There's some lecture, I don't remember which scholar it is, but it was at a conference put on by the Biblical Archaeology Society. And one scholar talked about, I forget if it was prophetic identities or messianic identities or something like that in late Second Temple times. And he was basically talking about how a lot of prophets in those times basically had conceptions of themselves as being anti-typical Moses figures or Aaron figures or Elijah figures or whatever. And it was even put in this way of like being a second Moses or an anti-typical Moses or a second, this or, that sort of thing. And as I was listening to it, whenever it was that I did listen to it, it just was so Davidian and branch Davidian that I was like, oh, wow, it's really incredible when you actually look at what scholarship has to say about the Jesus movement and about the Qumran movement in particular. It is so very reminiscent. Like, it's just so much the same of what we read in the Rod and the Branch. And in Adventism in general, when you look at older Adventist material, but even more so with the Rod and the Branch, because really the Rod is where things went like full-blown, like type, anti-type, and all that sort of thing. Same thing, the Branch even takes that further. And that's how these ancient people fought. That's how they went through things. And so it's really fascinating to see, basically, if you listen to sermons from people of other churches or even modern Adventist churches, and you listen to theological discussions of the Bible, you never hear people talking about the same things that we talk about in the Rod message, in the Branch message, and in this phase of the message. But when you look at what biblical scholars have to say, and I'm talking about academic, secular scholars, not theologians, then a lot of it is so the same, or at least parallel or reminiscent. So yeah, it is absolutely fascinating for sure.
Exactly. There's just so much parallelism of what they're talking about to what we know now, with, like you say, the Rod, SDA's Rod and Branch. It's like, wow, it's like a repetition of what these scholars have unveiled or unlocked.
I also have to mention briefly that this is why some scholars are actually quite interested in what they call Branch Davidia, although the way in which scholars usually consider it and use it for comparison is, of course, through David Koresh, because he is the one who became famous. But some of them take that further back and look at Lois Rodin, and Ben Rodin a little bit, Hoddef a little bit too. But it's not given enough attention, really. It's not given as much attention as it should be given. And, of course, people look to David Koresh for comparison and so on, because they're less familiar with other groups, and, they don't get into all of that, right? I understand if their primary interest in research is Second Temple times. I mean, if you look in the whole Branch Davidian world and everything that stemmed from it, that's a whole lot of material to go through, and they probably don't have time if they, have deadlines for writing their books and doing all these other things. But still, I think it would be absolutely beneficial and fascinating for some of these scholars to really, to read all of the literature that Hoddef and Ben and Lois wrote, and Doug and myself, and go further than that. Read everything that came from any Branch Davidian or came from a group that stemmed from Branch Davidians or whatever. There's just a lot of dealing with these sorts of issues. It's really fascinating. So we definitely have something to contribute, for sure.
For sure.
Okay, well, thank you for mentioning that. Does anyone else have any comments or questions? Okay, I guess not. So what we are going to do, and I've never read this before, so we're going to read it together for the first time. There is a book known as the Encyclopedia of the Dead Sea Scrolls, published by Oxford University Press in the year 2000 by Lawrence Schiffman, James VanderKam. I thought Emmanuel Tove was part of this as well, but perhaps not. Anyway, there are many other scholars involved. The two that I mentioned, Lawrence Schiffman and James VanderKam, are the chief editors of this volume. But there were other editors involved and advisors and contributors and so on and so forth. Anyway, it's a huge encyclopedia that basically talks about everything related to the Dead Sea Scrolls. So there's an article on the rule of the community. And I haven't read it, and I thought that maybe it'll be useful for us to read. And, since, we've been studying the community rule for quite a long time now, and, we have never read the whole text through together on the calls. And I encourage everyone to do that on their own time, to read it straight through in one sitting even, and then to study it more carefully, going all the way through the text. But we've tried to get a bit of the big picture, but only now are we really starting to talk about kind of manuscripts, and I figure reading a few of these things may give us a little bit of broader perspective, and also, this deals, like I said, I haven't read this, so I can't say specifically what this deals with, but what scholars have written on the community rule will deal with things like the dating of the manuscripts, comparing the manuscripts, and that sort of thing. So some of this is really the type of experiment where we are going to do indirect experiments because we are unable to do direct experiments ourselves. None of us here are paleographers, so we cannot examine the Hebrew text looking at the shape of the letters and so on and so forth and compare that with other texts to determine a date for the manuscript, whereas some of these guys are. So it's very helpful to read their writings on the subject because they have certain types of expertise that is relevant for understanding the community rule, which none of us have. So I think it's really important for us to always keep in mind how much we can learn from others. And, sometimes people get really proud by having a message of present truth and think that, we're not supposed to be learning from you guys. You're supposed to be learning from us because we're the guys at the top of the present truth food chain. So, whatever you have to say, no. Or if someone will be upset if they have to learn something from someone else. But we have to be humble and recognize that there's a lot that we don't know, and a lot of what we do not know, others do know. And, really, like when we're talking about questions of history and textual criticism and all of these other things, that's not where we have the leading edge, so to speak. That's not the same as having the present truth message. So if we want to have the latest knowledge on agriculture, well, there are agricultural experts. If we want to know about biology, there are biological experts. If we want to know about textual criticism, well, guess what? There are full-time professional textual critics, and we can learn from what they have to say. Of course, since we are devoting ourselves to the study of these writings, we should learn to do it ourselves too. But we can learn from others is the basic point that I'm trying to say. And we should be happy to learn from others and, of course, to contribute the message that our Heavenly Family has given us. And it's just keeping in mind the balance and kind of what we do uniquely have versus what we don't uniquely have.
We actually have the best of both worlds, don't we? We have the present truth, and we have, scholastic resources in at our leisure here.
Absolutely, totally. And here's the thing. If we just go with just simply the unique message that we have and ignore like history and all of that, well, actually, first of all, I'll just say that we can't do that because the message itself tells us to become acquainted with material reality. And so the message encourages us to understand elements beyond the unique aspects of the message. And that's really important to do for so many reasons. Because really, if we don't understand the surrounding information that anyone has available to them, even if they don't know it, we won't be able to provide the evidence that we might be able to provide for our positions. So, for example, early Adventists, they had an understanding of the Sabbath. Now, I've said many times how there are over 200 Christian denominations who are Sabbatarian, and that's true. But there were not that many when Adventism or when Seventh-day Adventism began. Now, there were already some. It's not like they were the first ones to come up with the Sabbath ever since the first century or something like that. But it was a more unusual position and one which they had to defend against the majority. And, of course, still today, the majority of Christians are Sunday keepers and so on. But guess what some of these early Adventists did? They basically became historians. I mean, you read some of the writings of the pioneers on the history of the Sabbath, and it's like, whoa, like, it's really scholarly and, like, actually, like, writing a history of the observance of the Sabbath. And that's a great thing. That's going beyond, like, that's engaging in activity that any secular person or any non-Adventist could do. It's doing the work of a historian. And early Adventists did that. And they did that in regard to several issues, not just the Sabbath. And so we should do the same thing. We need to engage in the relevant fields that pertain to subjects that in some way relate to the message. So the early Adventists had to read what secular historians had to say on the history of the Christian church, on the history of Sabbath, and so on and so forth. And they learned from that and did their own original research as well and built upon it. And, there are Seventh-day Adventist historians that other people have learned from today. Samuel Bakyoki, now deceased, he was a Seventh-day Adventist theologian and scholar. Like, he was beyond just a theologian. He didn't just engage in theology. He did historical research, and his study into the history of Sabbath observance and into the history of the Bible on alcohol and things like that have been influential beyond Seventh-day Adventism. It has influenced the world's scholars as well, because he just did a good job in his scholarship. And so, we've talked about before, what's the difference between what all of us can discover and study on our own and what is required to learn by means of inspiration. And we talked about how inspiration is really about the counsel, it's really about the mysteries of God and so on and so forth. Whereas doing this type of study is something that we can all do. And so, I think it's good. This is why we've made a resources page on our website to really acquaint you guys with the resources that you need to do study. And that's what we've been doing, a lot of this type of study on the calls for the purpose of all of us learning how to do it. And, look at some of the stuff published in the Biblical Archaeology Review, BAR, as it's called. Lois wrote and quoted from it a lot, actually. But that's a magazine put out by an organization that publishes the works of scholars related to the Bible and archaeology. And, if you read some of these writings of scholars, you can get some of that, the type of study that any of us can do, and the sorts of things that we can discover without actually getting into the mysteries of God. And it's a way to avoid being speculative. Now, I'm not saying that all scholars avoid speculation to equal degrees. Some scholars, you can tell, really do try their hardest to not be speculative, whereas others are a bit more free to speculate and develop theories without firm foundations. And that's something that we ought to do. So I'm not saying to follow the examples of scholars in all regards. However, I do think that everyone here can learn from serious, critical, academic, secular scholarship in terms of how you can go about studying in a way to learn the truth of what different of these texts have to say and the history of these texts, and just, come to it with the principles that you've learned in this message and apply that on this path of discovery. And, I think it's a good way to go for sure. So anyway, I'll read this article now from the, let me get the real title again. Okay, yes, the Encyclopedia of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So here they have it not under community rule, but rule of the community. So I'll read the article. Rule of the community. Occupying the major part of one of the 7 manuscripts that were found in 1947 in what was to become known as Cave 1 at Qumran, the rule of the community, 1QS, hereafter 1Q, rule of the community, was one of the first of the Dead Sea Scrolls to be discovered. At the time of its discovery and initial publication, 1Q, rule of the community, was given the title Manual of Discipline, but the text actually bears the title Rule of the Community, in Hebrew, Serek Ha-Yahad. And it is by this title that it is now known. The rule of the community is one of the most important of the sectarian texts, and its importance is underlined by the fact that fragments of no less than 10 copies of the rule of the community subsequently were found in Cave 4 at Qumran. Rule of the community, and then I think there's a little symbol, but I'm looking at a scan here of this document, and some of the print isn't all that clear. But Rule of the Community 4Q 255 through 264. In addition, 2 tiny fragments of a copy of the Rule of the Community were found in Cave 5, 5Q 11, and a quotation from the Rule of the Community is included in a fragment of another sectarian text from Cave 5, Rule 5Q 13. While little is to be made of the evidence from Cave 5, there are important differences between the Cave 1 version of the community rule and the versions preserved in some of the Cave 4 fragments. It has been argued that these differences cast an important light on the composition of the rule of the community, but their significance is disputed. All copies of the rule of the community are in Hebrew, and there is no reason to doubt that this was the language in which it was composed. It is assumed here that the community for which the rule was composed was Essene. See Essenes. The Cave 1 copy of the rule of the community not only is the best preserved copy, but also contains the longest version of this text known to us. For this reason, 1Q Rule of the Community is likely to remain the basis on which study of this document is conducted. But this does not mean that this version necessarily is to be regarded as the most original. The manuscript contains not only the Rule of the Community, but also 2 other works, the Rule of the Congregation, 1Q28a, and the Rule of the Blessings, 1Q28b. See Rule of the Blessings and Rule of the Congregation. That these are 3 separate works and not one single work is known by the fact that a space has been left in the manuscript between the end of 1Q Rule of the Community and the beginning of the Rule of the Congregation, and again between the end of the Rule of the Congregation and the beginning of the Rule of the Blessings. By the fact that on the outside of the manuscript the remains of a title are preserved, the Rule of the Community, and from ... which clearly seems to have referred to more than one work, and by the fact that there are differences of approach between 1Q Rule of the Community on the one hand and the Rule of the Congregation and the Rule of the Blessings on the other, perhaps the motive for combining all 3 works on one scroll lay in the fact that they are all concerned with the ordering of the life of the community. 1Q Rule of the Community with the community in the present age, and the Rule of the Congregation and the Rule of Blessings with the community in the future age. Recognition of the fact that 1Q Rule of the Community, Rule of the Congregation, and Rule of the Blessings form 3 separate works inevitably has led to the question of whether 1Q Rule of the Community itself forms a single work. However, although 1Q Rule of the Community is a composite, as we shall see, the arrangement of the text in the manuscript clearly seems to indicate that 1Q Rule of the Community was meant to be read as an entity. The physical arrangement of the text of 1Q Rule of the Community, the leaving of the ends of lines blank, the use of indentation, the placing of paragraph signs in the margin, serves to divide the text into paragraphs. But the text also contains a series of headings, normally followed by passages that are introductory in character. on the basis of which it may be divided into 6 main sections. 1Q Rule of the Community, column 1, lines 1 to 15, is an introduction that sets out the aims and ideals of the community. 1Q Rule of the Community, column 1, line 16 through column 3, line 12, is a ritual for the ceremony of entry into the covenant. 1QS, column 1, line 16 through column 2, line 18, to which are attached instructions for the annual renewal of the covenant. 1QS, column 2, lines 19 to 25a, and a passage on the need for sincere inner conversion on the part of those entering the covenant. 1QS, column 2, lines 25b through column 3, line 12. The ritual for the covenant ceremony draws its inspiration from the account of the covenant ceremony in Deuteronomy 27 and the related material in Deuteronomy 28 to 30. And of course, in our studies of the community rule, we actually likewise discovered that. So we know for sure that that's true. The third section, 1Q Rule of the Community, column 3, line 13 through column 4, line 26, is an exposition of the dualistic beliefs of the community, specifically the belief that the actions and the fate of all humans are under the control of one or the other of the two opposing forces in the world, the spirit of truth and the spirit of injustice. See dualism. Dualistic beliefs underlie a number of the other Qumran sectarian texts and are particularly prominent in the War Scroll 1QN, but they are not expressed elsewhere as explicitly as in this section of 1Q Rule of the Community. See War of the Sons of Light against the Sons of Darkness. Column 5, line 1 through column 7, line 25, are a collection of rules for the organization of the life of the community. The collection is somewhat random in character and contains the following material: an introduction, 1QS, column 5, lines 1 to 7a, a passage on the oath sworn by the new member on admission, column 5, line 7b to line 20a, a miscellaneous collection of rules governing such matters as the administration of reproof or the requirement that in every place where there are 10 men from the council of the community, there shall not be lacking a priest, column 4, line 20b through column 6, line 8a, rules for meetings of the community, column 6, line 8b through line 13a, rules governing the admission of new members, column 6, line 13b through line 23, and a list of punishments for the infringements of the community's rules, column 624 through column 7, line 25. The fifth section, 1Q Rule of the Community, column, it's hard to actually read this part. The printing is not that clear. I believe it's column 8, line 1 to a certain place, line 8, column 10 perhaps, line 8. A program for a new community frequently has been regarded as forming the core of the rule of the community. It provides rules for a community that apparently was on the verge of being set up in the wilderness, and to which the prophecies in the book of Isaiah concerning God's plant, Isaiah 60 verse 21 and 61 verse 30, concerning the cornerstone, Isaiah 28:16, and concerning the preparation of the way of God in the wilderness, Isaiah 40 verse 3, are all applied. When the community came into existence, its members would form the true spiritual temple and would, by the practice of righteousness and the endurance of suffering, make expiation for the land. In the wilderness, they were to prepare the way of God by living a life devoted to the study of the observance of the law. 1QS, column 8, line 1 through column 9, line 11. This section also includes a description of the duties of the wise leader or master, Hebrew maskil, column 9, line 12 to line 26a, to which is attached a liturgical calendar, column 9, line 26b to column 10, line 8, that prescribes the times at which praise was to be offered to God. See calendars and mishmarot. Because 1Q rule of the community, column 8, line 12b to line 14, refers to the withdrawing into the wilderness, it has seemed natural to relate this section specifically to the establishment of the community at Qumran. The final section, columns 10, line 9 to column 11, line 22, is a concluding hymn of praise, which may be compared with the hymns in Hodayot. Hodayot is Thanksgiving hymns, known best from a manuscript from Cave 1, 1QH, and to which the liturgical calendar 1QS, column 9, line 26b through column 10, line 8, serves as a natural transition. See article on Hodayot. It is generally accepted that 1Q rule of the community was copied in the period between 100 and 75 BCE. In other words, the first quarter of the first century BCE. And since there is evidence to indicate that the text was copied from another manuscript, it seems clear that the Cave 1 version of the rule of the community must have been in existence by at least the beginning of the first century BCE. However, it has been argued on the evidence of the Cave 4 manuscripts of the rule of the community that the Cave 1 version represents a late stage in the evolution of this text. As we noted above, fragments of no less than 10 manuscripts of the rule of the community were found in Cave 4. But in practice, it is only in the case of 3 of these, rule of the community B and D, 4Q 256 and 258 on the one hand, and rule of the community, I cannot make that letter out, unfortunately, but it's 4Q 259 on the other, that sufficient text has survived for the manuscripts to be of real significance for our understanding of the evolution of the text. Of the remaining 7 manuscripts, it must suffice to note that they range in date from the second half of the 2nd century BCE, rule of the community 4Q 255, to the first half of the 1st century CE, rule of the community H, 4Q 262, and that 2 of them, 4Q 255 and 262, preserve tiny fragments, 1 in each manuscript, that appear to form part of the section on the 2 spirits, but do not correspond exactly to anything in 1QS column 3 line 13 to column 4 line 26, and thus suggest the existence of an alternative version of this material. Okay, so that's basically saying that the even the section that we went through dealing with the 2 spirits does have other attestation in other manuscripts, but they are not very well preserved, and they do not match exactly with what 1QS has to say. Interestingly enough, the earliest text that they reference here, the text itself comes from the second half of the 2nd century BCE. So that's basically saying anywhere from 150 to 100. And so if that text comes from that period, that's very, very close to the original composition of the text in the first part of the 1st century. And, it could be that the community rule itself, maybe it came from 170, 160, 150. We don't yet know for sure. But anyway, some of these K4 manuscripts seem to be older than 1QS. But some of them are later, like from the first half of the 1st century CE. So that's literally from the time of Jesus. Like, it could have been written while Jesus was alive, or copied while Jesus was alive, I should say. Anyway, I'll continue reading this article. Rule of the community H and D belong together in that both attest a text that is considerably shorter than that of column 5 of 1Q Rule of the Community, in that both can be shown on the basis of the reconstruction of the extent of the manuscripts to have had a shorter text than that of columns 6 and 7 of 1Q Rule of the Community. In addition, both were copied in the Herodian script and date from the last third of the 1st century BCE, and both apparently contained a text or texts in addition to the rule of the community. So let's just take note of this. One of the things that is being said is that some of these manuscripts, 2 of them in particular from Cave 4, contain a version of the material that is in 1QS columns 6 and 7 that is shorter. But those manuscripts came after, because remember, 1QS is from between the year 100 and the year 75. But these Rule of the Community H and Rule of the Community D come from the last third of the 1st century BCE. So basically that's from, year 33 or 34 to year 1 BCE. So they were actually copied after 1QS was, and they have a shorter reading of those sections. Is that to say that the other one is more original, as represented in 1QS? That's something for us to discover, whether it means that or not. But it's interesting to take note of the fact that those copies do come later. But again, other copies came earlier, so we'll have to come to a good understanding of this. Continuing. Rule of the Community H contains at the end of what looks like the beginning of a further text, although it is impossible to say what this was, while the reconstruction of the extent of the Rule of the Community B suggests that the manuscript did include a further text or texts, whether a shorter version of the Rule of the Community and the Rule of the Blessings. There would not have been space for the exact equivalent of these texts or some other text. However, in one important respect, Rule of the Community B and Rule of the Community D differ. All sections of 1Q Rule of the Community are reflected in the fragments of Rule of the Community B, except for the section on the 2 spirits. Compare 1QS column 3, line 13, through column 4, line 26. And it is very unlikely that this section was not included in the text. In other words, Rule of the Community B basically has everything that is in 1QS. So there is another manuscript that has all the material other than the two spirits, but they're saying that most likely it had that section too, but it's not preserved. In contrast, the fragments of Rule of the Community D begin with the equivalent of 1Q Rule of the Community column 5. And it seems very likely that this was the beginning of the manuscript and that the equivalent of 1QS columns 1 to 4 never formed a part of this text. So one copy, Rule of the Community D, didn't have all, like it basically did not have any of the material of the community rule that we've actually investigated together so far. That's the first 4 columns of 1QS. So that's Rule of the Community D. But Rule of the Community B had all of that. And I'm trying to remember the dating of B and D. We'll find that out again, I'm sure. In fact, let me just go up a little bit here. Okay, it doesn't specifically say here. Okay. The manuscript that contains the fragments of Rule of the Community and then a letter, which I'm not able to read, unfortunately, also contains the fragments of a calendrical work, OTOT 4Q319. The fragments of Rule of the Community unreadable letter correspond to parts of 1Q Rule of the Community columns 7 to 9. But its text differs in some respects from that of 1Q Rule of the Community, above all in the fact that 1Q Rule of the Community, I believe it's E, and I think it's been talking about E this whole paragraph, does not contain the equivalent of 1Q Rule of the Community column 8, line 15b to column 9, line 11. Further, it is significant that no fragments corresponding to Rule of the Community columns 10 and 11, so it's 1Q Rule of the Community columns 10 to 11, the liturgical calendar and the concluding hymn, have been preserved. And the reconstruction of the manuscript makes it almost certain that Rule of the Community letter, possibly E, never contained the equivalent of 1Q Rule of the Community columns 10 and 11, but that the equivalent of the instructions to the wise leader, 1QS column lines 12 to 26, was followed immediately by the beginning of OTOT. It is also possible, but by no means certain, that this manuscript, like Rule of the Community D, did not include the equivalent of 1Q Rule of the Community columns 1 to 4. As to the age of Rule of the Community E, whereas Joseph T. Millick, 1962, dated its script to the second half of the 2nd century BCE, Frank Moore Cross has recently assigned it to the period between 50 and 25 BCE. The Cave 4 fragments of the Rule of the Community became generally accessible only in the 1990s, but even before their publication, although occasionally scholars such as P. Gilbert, 1958 to 1959, defended the unity of 1Q Rule of the Community, it generally was accepted that 1Q Rule of the Community was composite. Jerome Murphy O'Connor, 1969, whose account of the formation of 1Q Rule of the Community was the most influential and was further developed by, hard to read this name because of the printing, unfortunately, but it's something like Wilde, 1976, attempted to relate the evolution of the text to the history of the Qumran community and argued that the text was formed in 4 stages by successive additions to an original core. Stage 1, 1Q rule of the community, column 8, line 1 to column 10, line 8a, minus some additions, was intended as a manifesto for a new community and belongs in the period prior to the establishment of the community at Qumran. Stage 2, 1Q rule of the community, column 8, line 16b to column 11, line 2, with which Pauli included column 8, line 10b to line 12a, represents the addition of a small number of rules to take account for the realities of communal life and belongs to phase 1a in the occupation of the site at Qumran. Stage 3, 1Q rule of the community, columns 5 to 7, minus the interpolation of column 5, lines 13b to 15a, according to Pauli, column 5, line 13b to column 6, line 8a, consists of the addition of a collection of rules governing communal life and reflects the institutionalization of the life of the Qumran community at the time of the expansion of its membership at the beginning of phase 1b. Stage 4, 1Q rule of the community, column 1 to 4, and column 10, line 9 to column 11, line 22, plus the interpolation of column 5, line 13b to 15a, and column 10, line 4b, and column 10, line 6a, represents the addition some years later of material that was intended to revive the fervor of the members of the Qumran community. Murphy O'Connor's 4-stage theory represented a significant attempt to explain the evolution of the text of 1Q rule of the community. But in the light of the evidence of the Cave 4 manuscripts, it can be seen that even if his approach was broadly along the right lines, the process was more complex than his explanation suggested. Thus, while rule of the community D and rule of the community E can be interpreted to support the view that 1Q rule of the community, columns 1 to 4 and columns 10 to 11, were added at a late stage to the rule of the community, there is no unequivocal manuscript evidence to suggest that these sections were added at the same time and represent a single stage. Again, despite the fact that 1Q rule of the community, columns 5 to 7 and columns 8 and 9 are very different in character and presumably had a separate origin, there is no manuscript evidence to support the view that the equivalent of 1Q rule of the community, column 8 and 9, ever existed as a version of rule of the community apart from the equivalent of 1Q rule of the community, column 5 to 7. Sorry if this is a little tedious, guys. I know it's dealing with a little bit of the details right now, but there's a bit more to go, and I think it'll be worth it for us to read this. In a recent study of the formation of the rule of the community, Sariana Mezzo, 1997, has argued that although rule of the community D, D, and E, if Cross's dating is correct, are all younger than 1Q rule of the community, they represent alternative versions of the rule of the community that are older than that represented by 1Q rule of the community, and that behind both of them lies the original version of the rule of the community, which is no longer attested in any manuscript. This original version is likely to have consisted of a text parallel to 1Q rule of the community, columns 5 to 11. but with the shorter text of columns 5 to 7 represented by rule of the community B and D, and without the passage parallel to 1 key rule of the community, column 8, line 15b to column 9, line 11, in columns 8 to 9. The absence of the equivalent of 1 key rule of the community, columns 1 to 4, in this version is confirmed by the evidence of rule of the community D, and an absence of the equivalent of 1 key rule of the community, columns 10 and 11, is confirmed by the evidence of rule of the community E, and of rule of the community other letter, which dates from the period 100 to 75 BCE, and in the light of the reconstruction of the extent of the manuscript, appears not to have had this material. OTOT may have been included at the end of the text. This original version was then revised in 2 different ways. In the version represented by rule of the community E, substantial additions were made to the text parallel to 1 key rule of the community, columns 5 to 9, which were intended to provide spiritual legitimation for the community's regulations and to strengthen the community's understanding of itself as the true keeper of God's covenant with Israel. However, the equivalent of 1 key rule of the community, column 8, line 15b to column 9, line 11, was not included, and OTOT followed immediately after the end of the equivalent of 1 key rule of the community, column 9, not the final hymn of 1 key rule of the community, columns 10 and 11. Meso also believes that the equivalent of 1 key rule of the community, columns 1 to 4, was not included in the version represented by rule of the community letter. But it should be noted that it is far from certain that the equivalent of this section was lacking in rule of the community E. In the version represented by rule of the community, there are 2 of them, perhaps H and D, the shorter text parallel to 1 key rule of the community, columns 5 to 7, was retained, but a text parallel to 1 key rule of the community, 8, line 15b to 9, line 11, was included. The final hymn was added at the end in place of OTOT, and at the stage represented by rule of the community B, the equivalent of 1 key rule of the community, lines 1 to 4, was added at the beginning of the text. At a final stage, a redactor drew on both of these versions to produce the text of the rule of the community represented by 1 key rule of the community. Despite the uncertainties caused by the fact that rule of the community B and D and rule of the community E apparently are all of later date than 1 key rule of the community, Sariana Mezzo's account of the textual development of the rule of the community has a good deal to commend it. Her explanation takes account not only of the evidence presented by the various manuscripts, but also makes sense of the evidence provided by traditional forms of literary criticism of 1 key rule of the community. However, other scholars have argued for the priority of the text represented by 1 key rule of the community. Thus, Philip S. Alexander, 1996, in the most significant representation of this view, has argued that the dating of the manuscripts ought to be taken seriously in the reconstruction of the redaction history of the rule of the community. He believes that on text-critical grounds, 3 main forms of the rule of the community are to be identified. And on the basis of the paleographical evidence, he would date these recensions as follows. 1 key rule of the community plus rule of the community E, 4Q 257, approximately 100 BCE. Or he dates it to approximately 100 BCE. Rule of the community, actually I think the previous one was C. This is rule of the community E to approximately 50 BCE. And rule of the community B and D to approximately 25 BCE. In support of this view, he argues that it is just as likely that rule of the community E and rule of the community B and D are abbreviated texts as it is that 1Q rule of the community is an expanded text. Thus, for example, in relation to the fact that rule of the community E does not have the equivalent of 1Q rule of the community column 8, line 15b to column 9, line 11, Alexander argues that the omission of the material contained in 1Q rule of the community by the redactor of rule of the community E is just as plausible on internal grounds as its insertion by the redactor of 1Q rule of the community. Alexander's stress on the importance of the paleographical considerations has to be taken seriously. On the other hand, the view put forward by Mezzo better takes account of the indications within 1Q rule of the community itself that its text is composite, and that it acquired its present form by a process of evolution. The debate on this issue is far from over, but in the end, it may have to be recognized that there can be no certainty on the question of the redaction history of the rule of the community. The rule of the community and the Damascus document have enough in common for attention inevitably to have been focused on the relationship between them. See Damascus document. In fact, the two works are somewhat different in character, but there is a real similarity between the communal regulations contained in 1Q rule of the community, column 5 to 9, and those contained in the corpus of laws in the Damascus document. The relationship between these two sets of regulations often has been explained on the basis that the rule of the community was intended for those Essenes living at Qumran, while the Damascus document was intended for those Essenes who lived among their fellow Jews in towns and villages. The emphasis on the wilderness ideology of 1Q rule of the community, columns 8 to 9, give this explanation plausibility, and it is not totally to be abandoned. But some, at least, of the regulations included in 1Q rule of the community, columns 5 to 8, suggest that they, like those of the Damascus document, were intended for Essenes who were living among their fellow Jews. And the existence of other rules, particularly Serek Damascus, 4Q 265, has shown that the situation was more complex than a simple division between a rule intended for Essenes at Qumran and a rule intended for Essenes living elsewhere. See Serek Damascus. It is perhaps more accurate to say that the rule of the community and the Damascus document belong to different but related communities, and that the two works reflect the life and the history of these communities. It is significant that whereas the Damascus document refers to the group with which is concerned as a congregation, edah, the key word for the rule of the community is community, yahad. As we have seen, the rule of the community in the form represented by 1Q rule of the community was already in existence by approximately the beginning of the 1st century BCE. And the origins of the rule of the community must therefore go back into the 2nd century. In fact, rule of the community D dates from the second half of the 2nd century BCE. It often has been assumed that the teacher of righteousness was the author of the rule of the community, and this view has been linked to the view that the rule of the community, and particularly 1Q rule of the community, columns 8 to 9, was to be associated with Qumran, and that the teacher was responsible for the withdrawal of the community to Qumran. See Teacher of Righteousness. While all this is possible, it cannot be anything more than speculation, because the rule of the community contains no evidence about the identity of its author. So that's the end of this article from this encyclopedia on the rule of the community. So, are there any comments or questions concerning what we just read?
I wanted to ask, was it stated in there that the 1QS rules, the community rule, was for those living in the community, and there's a possibility that the Damascus document was for those living outside of the community?
That is one hypothesis that has been put forward, but then they said that that view is really too simplistic and it doesn't really account for all of the facts. For example, there are specific instructions given in 1QS and in other copies of the community rule that actually apply to those outside of the community. So there are things that say, like, wherever you may be, do this or whatever, or wherever there are 10 men who are members of the council of the community, do this. And, there are different things that are stated in the community rule that are clearly not just for those at Qumran. And, in fact, another thing that they pointed out is that it's possible that the core of the community rule was written before the establishment of the community at Qumran. So I myself don't see evidence for the idea that the community rule is intended only for those at Qumran, whereas the other one, Damascus document, is intended for Essenes elsewhere. In fact, there's quite a lot in the community rule to indicate that it's not exclusively for those at Qumran.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, no problem. Any other comments or questions?
So what did we conclude after all that?
Hilarious. As far as what we concluded that there has been a fair amount of scholarly discussion as to the history of the text, and that's about it. But that informed us about some of the various manuscripts, like some of the things that it pointed out that are worthy of note and that are worth, I'll kind of restate some of the things that we should definitely remember. There are at least 11 copies of the community rule that were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. So there's 1QS, which is the best preserved copy. That's the one we've been really focusing our studies on thus far. And so that's one copy found in Cave 1. And then there are no less than 10 copies found in Cave 4. And then there's at least a fragment of one copy found in Cave 5. So, that gives like 12 copies. And in fact, in another thing that I'll read next weekend, it talks about these 12 copies, and it gives translations of each of them, and so on and so forth. So that's one thing to remember, that there are about 12 copies that are known from the preserved Dead Sea Scrolls. Those copies are dated, the earliest of them, to the second half of the 2nd century BCE, so that's between 150 and 100. And the latest are from the first half of the 1st century of the Common Era, so between the year 1 and the year 50 or 51. So the actual copies range over that period of time, from about the year 150 BCE to about the year 50 CE. So those copies range in date in that period. Another thing to keep in mind is that among these copies there are differences. Some copies of the community rule, looks like 2 of them, begin with the material that is found in 1QS column 5. So the first 4 columns were not included in some copies of the community rule. Likewise, some copies did not have material found in columns 10 and 11, which isn't as meaningful to some of you now if you haven't read all of 1QS yet. But it's the last 2 columns of 1QS. Also, there are certain sections that are not preserved. Basically, what we'll have is in 1QS, it reads a certain way, and there's all this material. And in some copies, some of that material is just gone partway through, and it just, carries on to a certain point, and then it's as if it skips ahead. Like if we were to view 1QS as the basis, there are sections missing from it in the other manuscripts. But it may be that the other manuscripts represent a more original version. So there are differences, and those differences need to be studied carefully to discover what they mean. There have been different explanations put forward. Right now, there are kind of 2 competing ideas as to the history of the text. There was an older one that was kind of popular before the 1990s, but in the 1990s, the Cave 4 manuscripts were first published. And right now, there's kind of 2 competing theories as to the history of the text. One is put forward by a woman that we'll call Mezzo. That's her last name. And it basically says that 1QS represents the latest stage of development of the community rule, even though some of the other copies that come after it, basically, even though there are copies that come after it that differ from it, she thinks that those copies represent an earlier form, even though the dating of them comes later. And then the other idea is put forward by a guy by the last name of Alexander, and he says that 1QS represents more of an original form of the community rule, and that the other ones are extracts or short forms. So it's basically the 2 main ideas that we've already discussed, saying, hey, is it that 1QS represents the original form and that later people took little sections of it and just copied a certain section, an extract of the community rule? Or is it that these extracts were originally separate works and then they were combined into what we now have as 1QS? So basically this is just saying that those 2 possibilities are the 2 predominant theories among scholars right now. And, our job is basically to study, to find out what the real history of it is. I'm not sure those are, the 2 understandings of those 2 scholars, it's not like it's either one or the other. They might both be right on some points and wrong on some other points and so on. But those are kind of the main points to take from what we just read. Any other comments or questions from anyone?
Not me.
Okay. Well, I'll just mention that what we'll probably do next week is, next Friday night, we'll probably read a little bit from the publication that I mentioned last night by the Princeton Dead Sea Scrolls Project, they have a little introduction to the Cave 4 manuscripts of the Community Rule. I believe it's shorter than what we just read here, but it gives a concise summary of the various manuscripts and the dating of them. Yeah, it looks shorter than what we read for sure. So, yeah, it doesn't sound like there were any more questions so far as I could tell. So, yeah, anyways, we'll read a little bit from this thing next week. And, right now I just wanted to mention it may seem like it's really complicated and even just reading what we just read, it was written in a very meticulous way because the author wanted to be very specific. And so, there was a lot of wording things in a way like this. The material corresponding to 1Q rule of the community, column this, line that, to column this, line that, was not present in rule of the community H, and so on and so forth. And so it's very informative, giving a lot of information about the facts of the manuscripts, but it can be tedious because it has to be carefully expressed for sake of accuracy. But I just wanted to mention for you guys not to let that kind of put you off from it or intimidate you. It's just being specific. That's really all that's about. And in reading that, especially with you guys just listening to it, not having it in front of you, don't be disappointed or surprised if you weren't able to follow it entirely, because it's a lot of detailed information and you're just listening, you're not reading it, you're not looking at the various copies and manuscripts and all of that. And so it's no one's expected to kind of have been able to 100% follow all of that and to remember it all or anything like that. But we'll go through, it's not like we're going to read that again necessarily, but we're going to be going through some of the same information that was talking about in a more focused way, and we'll get a better handle of, the various manuscripts and what they have to say, and we'll compare them. And once we kind of get into the groove of it, it will, I'm sure, flow smoothly and everything. So with all that said, and if there are no other comments or questions, would anyone like to thank our Heavenly Family?
I just have a question. So what we're really trying to get at is, because of reading Cave 4 manuscripts, right? Finding variants with the Cave 1 manuscript, and that's specifically with the quote of the sons of Zadok was missing from the Cave 4 manuscripts, right?
Well, the thing with the sons of Zadok is just an example. It's not like we're going through all of this just to discover the answer to that question about the sons of Zadok. That's just an example, and many other examples could be given. That was just one that I gave because that's right there in the beginning of column 5, which is where we started. But there's a lot more than that. What we want to do is have a comprehensive knowledge of the history of the community rule, and for that we have to compare all the texts. If we didn't have any of the K4 manuscripts and all we had was 1QS, in a sense it would be a lot easier in terms of there would be less work on our plate to do, but in reality it would be harder to discover the truth of the history of the text because we would have less data to go on. So having the K4 manuscripts presents an opportunity to gain a more accurate understanding of the history of the text, even though it requires a bit more work to gain that understanding. Just kind of like having the book of Revelation without the book of Daniel might be like oh, yeah, this is great. All we have to do is work with this one text. But it's a lot harder to actually find out what it's all about when you don't have Daniel. Having Daniel, in a sense, creates more work because you have more to read and more to try and understand, more to compare, but it makes understanding the whole a lot easier. And so it's the same thing with manuscripts, in a sense, how having the cave-form manuscripts puts more on our plate to go through, but it increases the likelihood of us actually understanding what it is about and understanding the history of the text. So that's what we want to do. And again, the purpose of it is so that we can judge it rightly. Like, I really do want to know if columns 1 to 4, let's say, just as a hypothetical, if columns 1 to 4 were originally a totally separate writing, and then columns 5 to 9 were a separate writing, and then columns 10 and 11 were a separate writing, and then they were all pasted together. Well, if they were separate writings, we want to know that. We want to know if they were by separate authors. And if they were by separate authors, like, let's just give for an example. Let's say that columns 1 to 4 were written by the teacher of righteousness and are a product of inspiration. But columns 5 to 7, let's say, were written by someone later and are not a product of inspiration and actually contain falsehood. And then columns 9 to, columns 8 and 9 were separate, and columns 10 and 11 were separate, but let's say all of them are good. You know, whatever. We want to know that. And if we didn't know that, and if it's true that those are all separate, and if columns 5 to 7 contain falsehood, then we could end up rejecting the whole thing because of thinking that it's one text when really it's separate texts that were combined. You know, that's just an example. I'm not saying that's the case. I'm not saying that I think that's the case. It's not that I think that that's more likely than something else. I'm just randomly giving a hypothetical example of what might be the sort of conclusion we would come to and how that conclusion may impact what we do with all of the various materials that are in 1QS. Does that make sense?
Yeah, okay, I get it.
Okay, cool. All right, would someone like to thank our Heavenly Family then?
I will. Heavenly Family, I thank you for taking the time to teach us. I thank you for thinking that it's worth it to take the time to teach us. Seems like there's other people that would be better suited for this, but I know that you're just looking for people that are willing to be made willing, and I'm quite sure that we're all willing to be your students. And so I just thank you and love you and appreciate all the hard work that you're doing with Trent on our behalf and on the behalf of your kingdom and your glory. In the name of the branch, he and she. Amen.
Amen.
I just want to mention that none of us come out of the womb well suited for this sort of thing, but we all have the ability to gain a knowledge of how to learn all of this and to come to an understanding of the truth of this. And you know, it's going to take effort on all of our parts and all of that, but as insufficient and unschooled as we may be, we can certainly acquire this knowledge. So I totally, I hear everything you're saying to our Heavenly Family there, Mary, and I'm not trying to say what I'm saying now in order to correct you or anything like that. I totally get it. We are all unschooled and unequipped in many ways. Well, no, we are equipped now. Our Heavenly Family has been equipping us. But none of us are particularly skilled at this sort of thing, or just kind of like have it down and all of that. And I'm sure there are people who are better able to do this sort of study than any of us. But I just wanted to kind of mention this, like adding it as an encouragement to say, hey, yeah, you know what? No one starts out equipped, and if anyone is able to do this, it will be us, so long as we are willing to follow our Heavenly Family's lead, which I know is what you were getting at anyway, of being thankful for their guidance and all of that.
Amen.
Amen.
Amen. All right, well, love you all very much. Lila Tov.
Lila Tov.
Lila Tov.